Ukrainian and Russian officials met in the German capital for talks on ending the conflict in eastern Ukraine. But nearly 9 hours of talks on Thursday failed to produce a breakthrough on signing a joint document. However, both sides agreed to keep talking. Talks with French and German officials aimed at ending an 8-year separatist conflict in eastern Ukraine. But the lack of progress marked a setback for efforts to defuse the crisis. The conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk regions simmers on despite a notional ceasefire. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Ukraine of trying to rewrite the 2015 agreement, also accusing Kiev of cherry-picking only the elements most advantageous to it. Ukraine says it is committed to the accord. Ukraine rejects Moscow's assertion that it has nothing to do with the conflict. Kiev said Russia has forces inside Ukraine fighting alongside its separatists. Following the build-up of its forces near Ukraine, Russia held military exercises in Belarus and the Black Sea. Ukraine also staged war games, which will run until February the 20th. In a new point of friction, Ukraine criticized Russian naval exercises. Kiev said it was part of a hybrid war, adding that the exercises had made navigation in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov virtually impossible. Fearing an invasion, the United States urged Americans in the country to leave immediately. The advisory came due to increased threats of Russian military action. Leaders on all sides are still hopeful that diplomacy could still prevail. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that negotiations with the West continue in the open and closed modes and that Moscow is preparing a response to both NATO and Washington. US President Joe Biden urged Americans to immediately leave Ukraine as Russian troop deployment and military drills deepen fears of an invasion. In an interview to the NBC News, Biden said that things could escalate quickly and that if Russia invades Ukraine, there is no scenario where he would send in troops to rescue Americans if they are trapped.
What scenarios would you put American troops to rescue and get Americans out?
There's not. That's a world war. When Americans and Russians start shooting at one another, we're in a very different world than we've ever been in.
Biden's remarks came hours after Russia rolled its tanks across Belarus and conducted live-fire drills that drew ominous warning from NATO and added urgency to Western efforts to avert a feared invasion. Meanwhile, amid heightened tensions between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, the U.S. Air Force's B-52 strategic bombers landed in Britain for scheduled NATO exercises. The deployment comes amid fears that Russia is planning to invade its pro-Western neighbor, Ukraine. Joining us live from Berlin is our correspondent Trent Murray. Trent, good to see you. After talks with Ukraine in Berlin, Russia says that there has been no progress. What is the input from the ground as Moscow says that Minsk agreement wasn't discussed?
Yeah, there had been, I suppose, high hopes in some ways about these talks because really this is the only forum right now that the Russians and Ukrainians are speaking to each other directly. It's part of what's known as the Normandy format talks. They are essentially discussions hosted by both the French and the Germans to try and find a diplomatic way through this growing crisis on the border of Ukraine. But despite the talks lasting for over 9 hours, lasting well into the late evening here, they really failed to reach any major breakthrough. Both the Ukrainian and Russian sides leaving that meeting saying they weren't even able to agree on a joint signing of a document. The Ukrainian envoy in all of this, Andrei Yermak, said that obviously without de-escalation, without the withdrawal of Russian troops from our borders, one cannot speak about calm in the situation. So it obviously remains a very tense situation overall. Diplomats across Europe working just to try and keep the two sides at least talking about some of those disagreements like the Minsk Accords and how they should be interpreted. All of this, of course, happening, though, as Russia continues to flex its military muscle. NATO saying that over 125,000 combat troops have now effectively encircled Ukraine as part of those military exercises taking place with Belarus.
Trent, the West is ramping up pressure, warning of sanctions if Russia invades Ukraine. But are these threats going to work?
Well, that really, I suppose, is the million-dollar question that diplomats really, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic are struggling to come up with an answer to. I mean, effectively, the strategy seems to be here trying to dissuade and prevent any sort of attack on Ukraine by the Russian side, but also in tandem to make it very clear that if that happens, there will be, in the words of the German Chancellor, a very high price to pay. In fact, Chancellor Olaf Scholz yesterday, while those talks were taking place in Berlin between the Russians and Ukrainians, was actually hosting his own set of meetings with the leaders of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. Now, of course, those three countries effectively also sit on the border of Russia. They are right on the eastern flank of NATO, and they are growing very nervous about what President Putin may be planning. Chancellor Scholz, I have to say, took a slightly stronger tone than we've seen in the past. He said he wants to continue to talk about trying to find peace here with the Kremlin, but he said Russia should not underestimate our unity and determination as a partner in the European Union and as an ally in NATO. He himself will be travelling to both Ukraine and Moscow next week for talks with the respective presidents there. A very big moment for Chancellor Scholz, I have to say, given he's only been in the job since December, trying to fill some very big shoes left by former Chancellor Angela Merkel.
Live from Berlin, Germany, Trent Murray, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to us. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.